require exposure to conspecifics, then there's all sorts of ways that natural selection has exploited the ability of peers and conspecifics to impart information to each other, sometimes life-saving information, and all the sorts of information that makes one more likely to leave offspring behind. So first, there's the concept of imprinting. So some of you may have heard this idea before, which is that many precocial birds, upon first hatching, pay very close attention to any large objects that are moving around them that are nearby, because almost always that large object is mom. And so chicks, ducks, quail, things like that, they will pay very close attention to the things that are happening around them upon hatching, and will then follow that object or individual around, which is a good idea because that individual is going to take care of them, take them to food sources, things like that. And in these cases, notice that there's no need for natural selection to put inside the animal some idea of what a hen looks like, or a duck, or a quail, right? Or an ostrich for that matter, because who knows what the parent around you is going to look like. Rather, natural selection builds into the organism, if you will, the ability to pay attention to that object and learn who to take care of them. There's something mysterious about imprinting, which is people have had chickens and domestic fowl for thousands of years now. We know that. Growing up on a farm, I one time had 2 chicks that were rescued because mom got drowned in a rainstorm, brought them eggs into the house, and they hatched. And of course, I was interested to watch. And I was quite surprised to learn they were imprinted on me. And so like Conrad Lorenz going around with his geese, et cetera, they followed me all over. Now, humans have to have known about this phenomenon for thousands of years, right? You just can't raise domestic fowl and not know. But what I find is interesting is nobody seems to have written about it until almost the 20th century, where a guy sends off a paper to Nature describing it in the late 1890s, as I recall. Do I have it up there? Anyway, which just goes to show you these things are, that there's plenty to discover yet. Okay. And so Conrad Lorenz, the ethologist, was famous for having gray-lag geese imprint on him. Those whooping cranes were deliberately imprinted on that flying device, or rather, I forget, the flying device or the person that was flying it, in an attempt to get them to recreate their migratory pathway from the north to the south. And I'm not sure how well that's going, but it was a noble effort, and it worked because, right, if that was what they saw or close upon hatching, then they would follow it, even if it went someplace weird. And there's another sort of imprinting that you might not know about, which is sexual imprinting. In lots of these same individuals, precocial birds and the like, the chicks upon hatching are not just paying attention to who's feeding them in terms of, who would I follow in the future. If we're talking about altricial birds, robins, things like that, where the young are hatched and they're totally helpless. They can't go anywhere. They're going to be in a nest for a few years, and they have to be fed by the parents. In those cases, the animals are also paying attention to the qualities of who's feeding them, what their parents look like, because when they grow up, they're going to be sexually attracted to individuals that look like that. And again, there's no need for natural selection to find some elaborate way to have the genome tell each individual, this is what members of your species look like. All you have to do is pay attention to who's feeding you, and that tells you, what species you belong to. And also, to the extent that your parents have managed to reproduce, their qualities apparently are good enough to succeed, right? Because there you are. As the old joke goes, if your parents never had any children, odds are you aren't going to either. And so the fact that your parents succeeded means that maybe that's a pretty good object to imprint on. So if, for example, you move zebra finch eggs and put them into a Bengalese finch nest, when they grow up, the zebra finches won't be courting and trying to attract the attention of other zebra finches. Rather, they're going to be imprinted on Bengalese finches. Questions about that? Pretty widespread phenomenon, and there's probably some of it that goes on, in mammalian species too, but we don't have to belabor that. Another important, and I should say that for sexual imprinting, until people did these studies to look at it in the late 60s and early 70s, the assumption was that animals, when they grew up, knew what they looked like or knew what their conspecifics looked like, and that somehow that was built into them, that by instinct they'd know, oh, I should court that kind of a female, not that female of a different species. And not to belabor it, but of course, courting a female of a different species is no way to leave any contribution to the next gene pool, right? Because if it's a different species, the offspring, even if you have any, are going to be infertile. Okay, so far? Another sort of animal behavior that was widely known about and was widely assumed to be a matter of instinct is migration patterns. Primarily, we're talking now about birds because there's the one that can fly greatest distances to do this sort of thing. There are many birds that in the summer breed in the northern part of the hemisphere, and then when winter comes, go with their offspring south to milder weather, more food, etc., and return every year. And some aspect of this is probably there in the first place because people have raised various birds in isolation, and they've noticed that in the spring, they tend to flutter more on the south end of the cage, and in the summer, they tend in the spring, they flutter towards the north end of the cage, and in the fall, they flutter towards the south end of the cage. And they do this even if it's not spring or summer outside. That is, if you put them in day lengths that mimic fall or spring, they will show this migratory restlessness, without being taught. So that they don't have to be taught. They don't need exposure to conspecific to know. But then where do they go exactly? And in some cool studies that were done in storks that live in Europe, people noticed that there are some populations of stork in Western Europe that fly southwest to go across the Iberian Peninsula, across the narrow Straits of Gibraltar, and winter in West Africa. In Eastern Europe, the same species, those storks tend to fly southeast and will go over the Middle East and eventually winter in Eastern Africa, Kenya, places like that. So, but what folks did was to take some Eastern fledglings and move them and transplant them into nests in Western Europe. Now, if they had stayed, if they moved the fledglings after the local population had already left, those fledglings indeed seemed to know they should go southeast. So they went this way. And of course they were banded, and almost none of them were seen ever again. Because of course, flying over southeast means they've got to fly over the long Mediterranean Sea, and they've probably lost. But if those same eastern fledglings were moved west and brought there before the local population left, they always followed the local population. And in future generations, they took that migratory pathway. So clearly, if they're around peers, they learn what to do in terms of how to migrate. Questions about that? So it's an interesting mixture. Somehow they know to migrate certain times of the year, but which direction they go exactly, that depends on what the peers around you have done. And after all, they're here and just reproduced. So odds are their migratory pathway works. These are all examples of observational learning. And I think it's very interesting how many aspects of animal behavior are those that people noticed a long time ago that are often assumed to be the result of instinct. But it turns out that in modern times, people have noticed several cases where animals will show a new behavior, one that they hadn't seen before. The most famous example is in Japanese macaques, where some people that were studying Japanese macaques and purposely giving them carrots because they wanted them to hang around a particular area so they could observe them. Same sort of strategy that Goodall used to study chimpanzees, right? The way they were able to study those chimpanzees and get so close to them is for years, they brought a big bunch of bananas to a particular place every day, pardon me. Anyway, here they were using carrots to attract macaques, and they were being closely watched, and eventually they noticed one particular female monkey, a young female monkey, did something weird. She walked down to the river and dipped her carrot in the water. Presumably, she did this to get the sand off of it, right? Because it was on this sandy beach. And pretty soon, the whole troop was doing that. And you might have thought, they were somehow it was built in to know, dip your carrot. If you've got sand on your food, dip in the water and that'll get rid of it. But we know for a fact that wasn't the case. They learned it from that first pioneer. Later, she stopped taking her carrot to the river nearby and instead took it to the ocean that the river fed into and took to dipping her carrot there. Probably because she thought the salt tasted good, right? And sure enough, soon the entire troop was taking their carrots down to the ocean and dipping it there before they eat it. And the original female is long gone. Generations later, these animals are still showing that behavior. So clearly, they learned it from one individual. Another famous example are the birds in Britain. They're called great tits because that's the name for birds. In Britain, that's not their slang for breast, right? And basically, if you're a birder, they kind of resemble chickadees. They're basically their version of chickadees that we have here. And there came a point in the 50s when milkmen who would deliver milk, that's a thing that used to happen, noticed that their customers were complaining because sometimes when they went out in the morning to pick up the milk the milkman had left there for them, someone had punched a hole in the foil at the top. And what was going on here? And eventually they learned that in one part of Britain, is probably an individual bird, learned to poke through the foil and start eating the cream that was at the top. And because we know when that first started, eventually that behavior spread all through Britain. And there are no milkmen anymore, but eventually all through the Great Britain, animals had learned this new behavior as a way of getting food. An example that I think is pretty unpleasant is it turns out that in South America, I've forgotten which bay it is exactly, again, naturalists noticed a new behavior of gulls, which was that when the whales came up to breathe, as they're obliged to do, the gulls would land on their back and take a big chunk of their skin out and start eating the fat underneath the skin. You can't blame the gull. Gulls got to eat too, right? And we know that this is a new behavior, so there's no way that this is an instinctive behavior. And it spread like wildfire. So now there are lots of gulls in this particular area that are doing this. And unfortunately, it's the baby whales who are the most susceptible. Number one, because they have to come up for air more often. And number two, because their hide isn't as thick, and so it's easier to get to the fat layer underneath. And it's having a real impact on the population of whales there. Another example that I don't have a picture for, again in Eastern Europe, people noticed a new behavior of the I can't remember. I guess in Britain, I guess these are the blue tits, but maybe in Eastern Europe, maybe it was the great tits. Anyway, another species of chickadees, animals, where they noticed a new behavior, which is in wintertime, they would fly into the caves nearby where bats were hibernating and helpless, and they would start poking through the skin of the bats and eating fat from the bats. And again, if this behavior had first arisen before history, before anyone was writing anything down, we might have thought, oh, natural selection arranged for them to show that behavior. But because it happened after people were paying attention, we know for a fact that it was a learned behavior and that it spread through observational learning from one individual to another. Oh, and another example is when people brought sheep to New Zealand, English settlers brought sheep to New Zealand. There's a nocturnal parrot there called a kea that after a few generations, by the late 1800s, learned that there was a new source of food available, which is they would fly onto the backs of sheep at night. They're a nocturnal parrot, remember? And the sheep, of course, at night, when it's dark, they don't move. So they would latch onto the back of sheep and pull out big tufts of wool and then start gouging into the side of the sheep to eat fat, or sometimes maybe even get to the liver, and wasn't good for the sheep. We know this is a behavior that was learned because there hadn't been any sheep there, and the keas weren't showing that behavior until people brought them this nice, docile food source. It's not a big problem for the sheep industry in New Zealand because the keas themselves are greatly endangered, losing their habitat. Questions about that? How many other behaviors out there are due to learning? Another example, you've got the slide there, are African weaver birds who build nests. And again, it was assumed that natural selection had arranged for them to know how to build nests that worked. But when people paid closer attention, they realized that in different parts of their range, there are slightly different styles of architecture, and that the animals build their nests according to local architectural styles because they're watching one another. And so it may not be that built in. But perhaps the most famous example of where animals are provided by natural selection with the wherewithal to learn vital information in order to reproduce is in birdsong. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the ways in which birdsong may or may not be similar to language and people, except, it'll come up. But the important thing about birdsong is in those species that show it, for most of the species in North America at least, it's the males who do most of the singing and the females who don't. And these are species in which the males have to compete for finding a female that will accept their sperm and let them raise chicks together. Another thing that's important about these bird species is that for most of them, it takes two parents to provide enough food for the chicks so that they're going to survive. So in many of these bird species, they are at least socially monogamous, right? Because there's no point in fertilizing a female and running off because your egg, your genetic contribution there, isn't going to live unless you stick around to feed it. Well, different species have different kinds of songs. And again, in the 1960s, people noticed that for white-crowned sparrows in the Bay Area, for example, that white-crowned sparrows in Marin County had slightly different kinds of songs than the same species in Berkeley and the same species in Sunset Beach, further down on the peninsula. And they're all recognizably white-crowned sparrows, but there are local dialects. And you won't be surprised to learn that females gathered from those different places prefer the local dialect. And again, that makes good sense. If they've grown up in a place where this dialect is being provided by the males, and they exist, more specifically, if Dad sang this kind of song, then you want to find somebody like Dad because you know he reproduced, right? And so it turns out that these dialect differences is totally learned. So if you take the nestlings out of the nest and expose them to one particular dialect, they will reproduce whichever dialect they heard by the individual that fed them. That's the most salient cue. They'll even reproduce that dialect if you raise them in a box by themselves and just play them a recording of a particular dialect. So the animals are when they're young, they're paying very close attention to these songs, and they won't actually sing until much later. And then, even if they're by themselves in a box, they will start slowly reproducing the song that they heard. In a phase known as plastic song, when there's a lot of changes in it, they don't come out with it perfect the first time, but they will eventually listen to themselves producing vocalizations and keep changing until they reproduce a vocalization that's like the dialect they heard. Once they've perfected this dialect, in white-crowned sparrows and zebra finches at least, at that point, if you deafen them, their song really doesn't degrade very much because they've already learned it and it's happening. The other thing but if you deafen them in the process of developing the dialect, they kind of get, their song gets arrested at that point and never gets any better. If you deafen them before they've had a chance to start vocalizing, then they never produce any recognizable song at all. What's interesting about this is when this happens in animals in isolation, there's weeks, sometimes months, between when they last heard the song and when they first reproduce it. So the only way that can work is they have to have stored in their brain somewhere a template of what that dialect sounded like, so that when they start vocalizing themselves, they will figure out what to do with their vocal apparatus to reproduce it. Questions about that? And so this is an example of species-specific behaviors that is very much learned. People have even tried to take fledglings from one species and expose them to a totally different species song to see if they'll reproduce it. And so clearly, and that typically doesn't work. So clearly there are limits on how strange a song one of these songbirds will learn to reproduce. And in a famous experiment looking at this, Peter Marler and colleagues took two different species of sparrows, swamp sparrows and song sparrows, and this is what their normal song sounds like. And if they take the nestlings and raise them by themselves and never expose them to that song again, they each produce different songs, so-called isolate song, that are kind of similar to the species they came from, but are clearly not going to wow any females out there and say, oh, I want to, and people have tested this. Females do not find these isolate songs attractive. They're not going to give that guy the time of day. And again, they have to learn this, because if you deafen them before they've started singing, before plastic song, then they don't produce any recognizable sound at all. So before you took them out of the nest, they must have heard enough of the swamp song and remembered it enough that once they start plastic song, they try to reproduce it, but clearly their memory's not all that good and they don't do that good a job. So, can swamp sparrows learn to produce the songs of song sparrows or vice versa? And in the famous experiment, they took swamp sparrows and song sparrows, and this is what their normal song looks like. And clearly it's learned, because if you isolate them, they don't do nearly as good a job. And then they purposely used computers to make synthetic songs that would sometimes have an element of the other species, maybe in the timing of your species, or the timing of your species using elements from the other species. And what's interesting is, in this case, there's swamp sparrows that were exposed only to training songs of song sparrows, is that in both cases, they have swamp sparrow syllables, but they've kind of put them together in a song sparrow way, but they're clearly not. They weren't able to reproduce song sparrow song. So clearly there is some limit on how far this ability to learn whatever song they hear can be incorporated. Questions about that? And I can't talk about Birdsong without telling you about one of my favorite findings in the neurosciences, which is the neural pathway for learning song is very well mapped out. So the song is controlled by motor neurons in the hypoglossal nucleus, they control the vocal organ, which is called the syrinx in birds, quite different than mammals. And the motor neurons in the 12th nucleus receive inputs from a region known as RA, which itself receives input from a higher region known as the higher vocal center, HVC. So once an animal has learned to produce a song, lesions anywhere along this pathway will disrupt it. And if you make the lesion before the animal's learned the song, it never learns it. And even if you wait until it has learned the song in a so-called crystallized song, and deafening it won't stop it from making the song anymore, but lesioning in any of these areas will stop the song dead, right? They can't produce it anymore. What's interesting is there's another nucleus involved in this. Here is what's known as the short pathway to produce song, and that's all an adult needs to produce its song. You can lesion in other parts of the brain, and there's no disruption of song. But there's also a longer neural pathway where HVC projects to a nucleus known as X, which projects to a midbrain nucleus known DLM, which projects to another nucleus in the forebrain called LMAN, which projects to RA. And it turns out that for the animal to learn the song, LMAN has to be intact. If you lesion this nucleus before they've produced a full song, they never get any further. So it's clearly needed for them to learn the song, but once they learn it, lesioning LMAN has no effect on it anymore. So this indirect pathway, this long pathway, is somehow important in letting the animal learn how to produce the song that duplicates the template they learned back when Dad was singing and feeding them. Got that so far? And in the only example of this that I know of, after the animals have learned the song that Dad's singing, and before they produced it themselves, the size of LMAN shrinks, even though the brain overall is getting bigger, because after all, they're only 25 days of age, and they don't reach adult brain size until 53 days of age. Even though the brain overall is getting bigger, LMAN is shrinking. This is the only instance I know of where a known brain function, where a brain region gets smaller after it has completed its only known function, which is to help the animal learn. Questions about that? I guess at some point natural selection decided, well, don't need to waste any resources in that nucleus anymore because the job's done. You okay? Why aren't there more questions? Because it's so crystal clear. Because the semester's long. And it will, yeah. All right. Well, so it must be time for a Kahoot. Right away, in case it, revives your energy or whatever. So here are the things we're going to talk about next. Whether it's a paralleled birdsong or not, clearly human language is important for our species, right? It's almost certainly explains how it is we've managed to take over the world, for better or worse. And it's a powerful device. One of the things that makes it powerful is because of the fact that with a long protracted childhood, people can impart an awful lot of information into a child when they have this higher order symbolic language, where you can talk about things that aren't even visible right now, but the things that are going to happen in the future, et cetera. And it's clear that humans are very, very good at learning languages. And the interesting thing about language in children is that children learn language even though no one explicitly teaches them, right? On the other hand, there are things that people do around the world that are similar. Every culture that's been examined people talk differently to babies than they do to other children and to each other. It's usually known as motherese or parentese, this extending out the vowels and looking at the child and trying to put more lilt and excitement in it. Every culture, that's how people talk to babies. And it's probably important for the baby to start paying attention to and learning language. And there are also instances, there are certain inherited disorders of language where people identified in a British family where, according to the pedigree, there seemed to be a dominant problem with language in that individuals with this particular gene, this particular allele for the gene, had a hard time learning language and had particularly hard time learning particular grammatical rules. I mean, it's a strikingly specific language disorder, which tells you, which you wouldn't be surprised to know, of course, there have to be genes that have to function well in order for the brain to learn a language. And what's interesting, to my mind at least, is that this gene, this allele, is a transcription factor known as forkhead box P2. And the forkhead refers to the fact of how it latches onto DNA to affect gene transcription. And what I find most fascinating about it is it is the same gene, Fox P2, that if it's knocked out in songs, in bird songs, if it's knocked out in birds, it disrupts bird song. And if it's knocked out in mice, it disrupts ultrasonic vocalizations. So this is a transcription factor that somewhere in the common ancestor with ourselves and birds seems to be playing a role in peer communication within a species. And that by itself kind of brings home to you that human language didn't come out of nowhere, right? It didn't develop spring full-blown from the head of Zeus like Athena, right? It had its evolutionary precedents, and some of them have been out there a long time because communicating with your peers is a vital, advantageous strategy for staying alive long enough to reproduce. It has a great reproductive advantage. There are also inherited disorders that cause individuals to be particularly adept at language. So Williams syndrome, it's an interesting syndrome. It occurs when there's an entire chunk of a chromosome that's missing in these individuals. And it's not fatal, right? They survive the fact that they're doing without big chunks of genes. But what's interesting about them is they have a very prominent and obvious facial expression, sort of a pixie-like expression. And these individuals intellectually are fascinating because they are very articulate, they are very social, they love people, they love talking to people. They also tend to be extremely musical. And yet, in other ways, they are intellectually disabled. Many of them never quite learn how to tie a shoe. You give them a task where they're to put different shaped blocks through different shaped holes. They find that very challenging. They can't do that. And so in terms of reading, they're not so good at reading, but they're great with spoken language. And so that tells you a couple of things. Number one, there's certain aspects of intelligence that are, specifically important for language that may or may not be important for other problem-solving tasks, right? And it also tells you there's some connection between music and language, right? Which you might have guessed anyway. Surely the first music involved people in the plains of Africa doing vocalizing in ways that they found interesting or fun, right? And so, and it was probably the same sort of vocalizations that were being used. Questions about that? And another thing that's interesting about language acquisition in children, even though there's no explicit instruction, is in cross cultures and across languages and across individuals, there are differences between individuals in how quickly they reach various language milestones, but the sequence of milestones is almost invariant. And I don't need you to memorize any of them there. I put them up there to give you an idea of, the sort of progress that happens, and the fact that it's that invariant sequence suggests that, in fact, that there's an unfolding of a program that helps them to understand language. One of the things I find most fascinating about learning language concerns phonemes. Questions about that so far, about the chart? If you have a kid in the family that's, not quite where it says in the chart, don't worry. I mean, there's individuals vary, and it's going to be fine. And what's interesting about babies learning language involves phonemes. So a phoneme is a particular sound that occurs in speech that is distinct and is important for providing information about a word, etc. Across all human languages, people have identified about 160 different phonemes, but most languages use only a small subset of those. So, for example, in some Asian languages, individuals who have spoken only Japanese, for example, have a very hard time distinguishing R sounds and L sounds because they don't occur very often in that language. And it turns out that at birth, every infant is able to distinguish every phoneme equally well. How do you know what phonemes babies can distinguish? Well, you use habituation tasks, where you have a baby suck on a pacifier, and for sucking on the pacifier, you play it a sound. And when you first do this, babies are interested in that sound. And so they'll suck more to hear the sound. But if they keep hearing the same sound over and over, they grow bored with it. Sort of like you when I keep talking on and on, right? They grow bored with it and stop sucking for it. This means that you can tell how good they are at distinguishing two phonemes. So if, for example, you make a switch to phonemes that, because they've been computer produced, are very, very similar to each other, you can tell that they can't tell them apart, right? Because you're playing the other phoneme, but they don't seem to notice because they continue to find it boring. On the other hand, if you give them a distinct phoneme, and sometimes in terms of the computer generation, these might be pretty subtle too. In English, we use lots of words that make the difference between b and p, but those are very similar to each other in many ways. And yet you can tell the baby can tell them apart because it will dishabituate. If you play at the other phoneme, it knows that's a different phoneme because suddenly, oh, I want to hear that again. What was that? This is a great instance of reading babies' minds, right? If you wondered if they have one, yes, they do, right? And they're paying a lot of attention to language, and they're paying a lot of attention to phonemes. As I said, shortly after birth, all babies can distinguish all the phonemes, meaning Japanese babies can distinguish R sounds and L sounds very easily. But as they grow older and are being exposed only to Japanese, they lose the ability to distinguish those phonemes. And so if you want to learn a language with a new phoneme in it, you want to do it when you're young, because if you wait too late, you may not be able to distinguish phonemes that are important for the people you're speaking to. This is why the American tradition of teaching languages for the first time in schools, when people go to middle school, drives me crazy. It's designed to fail. It's about as stupid an educational move as you can make, but nobody wants to pay for language instruction early in life. And, the American attitude is English is the only language that matters anyway. Question.
Why do the languages of the United States
Pardon?
Why do we learn the ability to distinguish between?
You mean why do we lose the ability to distinguish? I mean, it's a great question. Of course, I don't have a great answer. It could be that in terms of processing language, that there's some cost to be paid for distinguishing phonemes that nobody's using around you. And that somehow there's some economy of, well, no one's using those phonemes around me, and so I'm not going to pay attention to them, and I'm never going to learn to distinguish them. And so what people have shown is you can compare languages, so at 6 to 8 months of age, American infants and Japanese infants are equally good at distinguishing the R from the L sound. But you wait just a few months later, and the American infants are getting better at distinguishing those phonemes, and the infants that have been around have only been hearing Japanese get worse at it. And so natural selection did not put into you the ability to distinguish some subset of phonemes. Rather, it put into you the ability to learn any phoneme that the human vocal tract can produce. And then it relied on the fact that the individuals around you will be using some subset to have you hone in on and really learn those distinctions very well so that you could communicate later in life, which is important because otherwise you're not going to leave any children behind. Odds are. Yeah.
Yeah, although so hypothetically, let's say.
Pardon?
Hypothetically, at a young age, let's say 6 to 8 months, you learn 2 languages.
Yeah.
And then let's say you grew up after that learning one language more often.
Yep.
And then let's say you come back at 16, 18, and then you try to relearn the language. Will that information still be stored, or how did it?
It's a great question. That's why I totally envy those of you who grew up around several languages. So in terms of the specifics, how much can you learn and how often? It probably depends. But here's a very common phenomena among immigrants, which is that they may grow up in a household where the parents speak one language, and but they're going to school where people speak another language, and those children tend to grow up to be totally bilingual, right? And that's why I'm so envious. Right? I've met individuals who speak 3 languages, totally different from each other, and I have an acquaintance who her children speak Mandarin, English, and Spanish, all of it, with no accent, etc. And it's like, and the brats didn't even work at it, right? It happened because mom spoke Mandarin, dad spoke Spanish, and they went to school and learned English, right? And so they can distinguish all those phonemes, and including the quite challenging phonemes for most American speakers of Mandarin in terms of it as a tonal language. More about that later. Anyway, so to the extent that the infants are hearing the language as they're growing up, it is going to help them. I meant to say, another common immigrant version is when one parent speaks the local language and another parent speaks the other. And even if, and this is, I would urge this, even if the parent with the other language makes a point of speaking only that language to them, the kids, after they go to school and watch television stuff, they don't want to use that other language, right? They want to use the language that's on TV and that kids are speaking. And so they won't use it. And, they don't end up knowing it as well as they would. But for the most part, they have a much easier time learning that language than, someone who's never been exposed to it. Anyone have any personal experiences with this that you can share? All I heard growing up, were hillbillies, right? So I'm hopelessly monolingual. Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah. Pardon?
Certain age after which it would why it's do this thing.
Is there a certain age after which it's no longer that beneficial?
Yeah.
I can't remember if I included the graph here, but yeah. For most people, what's most challenging, even if you know the phonemes, is learning grammar. And after 12 years of age, it's much more difficult to do. And, that's about the time kids go to middle school and, let's learn a new language. And, remember this grammar.
Well, so for the example you mentioned, both parents speak a different language, also different than their general language. All three kids speak three languages.
Right.
Well, you also said that if one parent speaks the general language and the other one doesn't.
The local. I mean, you must all know examples of this where one parent makes a point of speaking only Spanish, maybe even both parents speak only Spanish, and they'll talk to the kid in Spanish, but the kid answers in English.
But if it's two parents with two different languages, they learn three.
Yeah, and there's an interesting phenomenon that happens called code switching. When they go home, it's like they seamlessly start using the other language. Yeah. I'm sorry, does it only occur?
Maybe also like occur when you learn to read by a language. Like, for example, if you grow up, like I would like learn how to speak a language that you can't necessarily like read or write. Does that like do you have an easier time when you're younger learning how to read and write it too, or is that?
It isn't studied as well, but I would assume so. But yeah, in many of these cases, they might not know how to write the language. Think about Mandarin, for example, right? Where that's really going to take if they're going to learn that, they really need teaching right away, early, or especially any language that has different alphabet, right? So, is there another? Okay, yeah.
You think longer for kids learning two languages at a time? Let's say Japanese language. Would it take longer for that kid to learn English than when compared to a kid who's only learning English?
But what's interesting about bilingual kids is that when you go back to that checklist, the order in which they reach various milestones, what's interesting is that bilingual kids are typically delayed in those things. But by the time they're 5 or 6, it's gone. They've caught up with everybody else, and now they have all sorts of advantages that monolingual folks don't, including stuff you wouldn't expect, like faster recovery from stroke, less likely to suffer from dementia. I mean, the benefits of bilingualism, and you can arrange for your kids to have it, are clearly lifelong and enormous, and have not, quite apart from being able to speak with different people. Yeah.
Well, kids, is it easier to study a third language at adult?
I don't know if it is easier for them to study third language. I don't know. I would suspect so, is especially one similar to one of the two that they've grown up with. There's an interesting thing that happens with people. It turns out once people have learned like 8 or 9 languages, then they become incredible at learning new languages. So there are people out there that, that speak lots of languages, and if they need to pick up a new one, they do it right away. It's like they figured it out somehow. And the brain remains plastic in that way in which others of us don't. Oh, and here's another example of phonemes where, if the let's see, percentage distinguish. Oh yeah, that adult English speakers can't distinguish these phonemes, but their infants can very well. Phonemes in Hindi in that case. There's an interesting thing then about this idea that your cognitive apparatus has to be exposed to phonemes early in life in order for you to distinguish them, which is that people have noticed, first of all, where are the languages that have the most phonemes? Well, Africa, right? So there are, I can't make any of these sounds, but those click languages, for example, very important there, where we have a hard time reproducing them, much less hearing them, etc. All the languages with lots of phonemes, like the Kung language of Bushmen, they have more phonemes than we do. Whereas English, for example, has, 40 maybe. Yeah, 45 phonemes out of 160. And so people have realized that if you just look at the pattern of the number of phonemes in various languages, that the further away populations are from our origin in Africa, the fewer phonemes they have. And this developmental mechanism I just told you about could explain that. That once a phoneme drops out of a language, it's never coming back, because the infants growing up in that language aren't going to be able to distinguish it, and so it's never going to catch on as a way of making a new sound in that language. And so if you trace the migratory pathways that are known, right, in terms of, here's the latest, one of the latest spreads into North America, and most Native American languages have relatively few phonemes, and the language you might be somewhat familiar with that has among the fewest is Hawaiian. And those people probably got there in boats, etc. And so you can imagine that as the human species spread across the globe, each with their local language, that if for whatever reason a particular phoneme dropped out, it's never going to come back. What's also interesting is if you look at populations of humans for the most genetic diversity, guess where the highest genetic diversity is? Yeah, Africa. Africa has the most diverse human populations in terms of genes in the populations. So it's possible that this was behind. Oh, and here to get to your question, ability to learn grammar. You know, you want them to be exposed in the first 6 years or so for them to have a good chance of learning the grammar. And after that, things are much harder. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but there have been famous cases of children who were not exposed to language early in life. And it is totally debilitating when that happens. You might have heard of this particular unfortunate child, Jeannie, is the pseudonym given to her, who, until she was 12 years old, her father insisted that she live in a room in the back, and they would throw food to her once in a while, but nobody ever talked to her. And for a while, they strapped her to a potty chair, because I guess they didn't want to keep cleaning up, etc. And she was only discovered when her mom went to a social worker in Los Angeles, and the woman noticed that that Jeannie was with her, and she had this weird way of walking and holding her hands, etc. And she looked to be about 7, and so she said, well, how old's your daughter? And she said she's 12, because, of course, she'd been undernourished all these years. And eventually they investigated the home and found out what had been going on. The father killed himself rather than face criminal charges, etc. So what happened then, at 12 years of age, there was this intensive effort to try to teach Jeannie language and to help her develop intellectually. And it was mostly a failure. Probably they were there too late. She never really learned language. She would, string a few sentences together, but her vocabulary remained very stunted. Her father claimed that she was mentally disabled from the beginning, which no excuse for what he did, of course. And so you might think, well, maybe that was the problem. Maybe it's not that she was isolated maybe it's not that she became mentally disabled because she was isolated. Maybe she was isolated because she was mentally disabled. And that concern covers all the cases of so-called feral children that have been talked about and known about over the years. The thing about Jeannie, though, is once she started getting nutrition, etc., her growth, she caught up quite a bit. So clearly she had been undernourished, and although her IQ never got very high, her IQ never got higher, but as she got older, her abilities did get better. So clearly she was able to learn. And I think the assumption is, I think the safe bet is that in terms of intellectual development, she was totally disabled by not being exposed to people and languages. And this then brings us to a controversial set of experiments that you've almost certainly heard about that took place in the 50s and 60s by a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin named Harlow, who was studying rhesus macaques and studying what happens when a newborn rhesus is raised alone. So these animals would be fed, clothed, taken care of in every way, and they would grow up. Their physical growth was just fine, but growing up by themselves meant that they were permanently disabled as a monkey. They could not succeed. So the one question was, would they rather cling to a wire dummy that provides the milk or a soft dummy that doesn't provide the milk? And the answer was quite clear. They wanted the soft dummy, even if they had to stretch over and reach to the bottle over there in order to get nourishment. Harlow was unapologetic at claiming that he was studying love and that primate infants require love in order to grow up properly. And in terms of these macaques, love meant someone that you could cuddle with. And these isolated monkeys were incredibly distressing to see. If you put a lot of them together, they often rocked their bodies. They like to rock. And you put a bunch of the motherless monkeys together and they'd rock together and were clearly highly anxious, highly afraid, and not very able. If you waited until they were grown up to expose them to other monkeys, they were totally helpless as monkeys. The other monkeys hated them. They didn't know how to approach them. The other monkeys would attack them. They would attack the other monkeys. They were basically defective monkeys. Yeah, Tone.
As is that budget about the current investigation was where the people, I guess, people started to use more that they're getting paternal information on.
So say it again.
So your person at Wisconsin.
Yes, Harlow.
What says experiment the follow-up of rodent in the maternal separation model?
No, it was kind of the other way around. And Harlow's studies made an enormous splash. Let me also say a little bit more about that. And the motherless monkeys, if the females, when they grew up, they couldn't reproduce, right? They couldn't go through the behavior needed to get another monkey to mount them. And so eventually, what the group did was used artificial insemination to make these motherless females pregnant, and they were horrible mothers. They would give birth, and they wanted nothing to do with that infant. They might attack it, they might kill it in some cases, and so they were totally worthless as a monkey. They're adaptive. They were totally maladaptive at reproducing. What's interesting is the Harlow group found one way of treating these isolate animals that was more or less made them normal, which was they never gave them access to a mother, but they found that if they gave the motherless infants access to other infants to play around with as they grew up at a regular basis, then they acted pretty normal when they grew up. And most of the deficits of having been isolated, being motherless, were gone. So yeah, mother provides nourishment, etc. But if she's a horrible mother, a lot of that bad effect can be obviated by being around other peers of your age. Yeah.
Were the peers closer to each other than others?
Were the peers closer to each other? Those that were motherless, I don't know. I mean, usually they were mixed groups, and so they would purposely have both motherless peers and mothered peers. There was another hen went up there. Oh, yeah.
It reminds me of the experiment with rats where there was a different corticosteroid.
Yep. This is very reminiscent of the later studies we found where motherless rats or rats whose mothers didn't provide them with much stimulation were more anxious when they grew up. Absolutely.
Is this then because of stress response or because of like?
Why are they this way? Certainly they are more stressed. And when they measured stress levels, hormone levels, they were through the roof. So certainly that is true. But in terms of not being able to interact with other monkeys, it was because they'd never learned that. And so one of the other things this demonstrated is animals have to learn how to behave around other animals in order to have a chance of being reproductively successful. And that's pretty widely true. So this research was incredibly impactful and controversial. It probably came to a head when I think CBS News had a primetime news program about it and showed people, and the outcry of how cruel these experiments were was pretty awesome, right? Pretty vocal and pretty widespread. And there are all sorts of questions one might ask about such monkeys these days, but nobody's doing this research anymore. I think most people feel like they learned the important things there were to learn. But I want to give you a context for this, which is at the time Harlow began ththese experiments, all the experts on parenting, all the advice books, they were as prominent in the 50s and 60s as they are now, up until the 50s, they all warned parents not to be too close to your kids, not to hug them, not to kiss them, that you needed them to learn to be independent. And the upper class British way of raising children was you sent them off with a nanny and they came in to say hi to their parents every day at tea time, and otherwise they never saw them again. You weren't supposed to be too physically affectionate with them. And I have to say, I mean, a lot of people think that it was Harlow's experiments that got people to start rethinking that. Because after all, those experts, they were just people that wrote books. They didn't know anything. They hadn't done any science. They weren't doing experiments. They reasoned, oh, if you want independent children, you don't want to coddle them too much. Question. Good. In at least some of the experiments, the other peers were also motherless, and that still seemed to ameliorate most of the damage of not having a mother. They could, for example, learn to play, right? And this is part of a long line of experiments that indicate that juvenile play is not play. It's important. Allison?
But could the ones that were raised just with their peers become good mothers?
And yes, and the ones that were raised with their peers, they were not horrible mothers. They were totally competent mothers. Yeah.
I think there's an upper limit on affection, or can one of that?
No.
Is there an upper limit on affection? It's a great question. Harlow didn't do that experiment. I don't know. But certainly there are cultural differences and differences of various groups in terms of ideas of whether it's a good idea or not to hug and kiss your children and stuff like that, right? But nobody's saying science has shown you should ignore your children. Yeah.
So in talking about instincts, would you say that these monkeys, for example, they don't have any instincts?
So I mean, you hear people talk about the maternal instinct. Well, these monkeys, if it's an instinct, they didn't have it. Why? Because it's not just an instinct. It's something you have to learn, something you have to model. And I'll remind you of those rat and mouse mothers who don't pay much attention to their offspring when they're growing up, aren't doing it that much of the anogenital licking and grooming, etc. Their daughters, when they grow up, they also tend to not do it very much. So if they have an attentive mother, they grow up to be good mothers. If they have an inattentive mother, they grow up to be inattentive mothers. And in some of the experiments, at least genetically, they're all the same. So here's this intergenerational behavior that's being passed on not through the genes, but through observational learning. Okay, when we get back, we'll talk a little bit more about intelligence and maze running in animals, and then we'll start talking about the controversial stuff.
And